The waiting area outside his office, it always seemed to be full. People with sad and sometimes desperate faces, they waited extra minutes, extra hours, sometimes even whole days to see him rather than one of the other loan officers. They sat with their styrofoam cups full of bad office coffee and they waited patiently. Now, when people were leaving his office, they might be wiping away a tear or even smiling a little shyly as they left. On days when the loan department met in the room with the big table and the leather chairs, you could see through the windows the discussion was serious. And he was often in the thick of things. As a management trainee, I soon learned that he was often on the hot seat, explaining why he'd made bad loans or extended them. His peers and supervisor did not seem pleased on these days. They often emerged from this meeting with dour looks on their faces, and they headed straight to the break room or the bathroom, or if they were lucky, out to lunch. I thought about this paradox when reading today's lectionary scripture. The look on the faces of the people leaving this man's office and the look on the faces of his peers and supervisors leaving those loan meetings. I wonder about the folks that would have heard this story from Jesus at first. Jesus talked about the Pharisees who were just a little too caught up with money. So what will these words mean to us? What does it mean when a good loan officer is one that says no more often than yes? Well, consider these questions and this one as we hear these words. What do we value? Now, some ministers have written about this confusing parable from Jesus as, is it really time for that parable of the dishonest servant? Yes, friends, it's time for that parable. Let's see if we can sort it out first by hearing it from Luke 16, 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' And he replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much." And the last words of this scripture end with this: "No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." You cannot serve God and wealth. Now, last week we talked about the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coins. And that other parable I mentioned earlier, the prodigal son, the lost son, That story's probably more familiar to people than even the lost sheep or the lost coin. But in this part of Luke, there are 5 parables. There is the lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost son, and then there was a rich man. And another one, there was a rich man. Now, we sometimes let ourselves off the hook by skipping or glossing over these last 2. Today, we're looking at the first one that begins, there was a rich man. But to understand all of these teaching parables, we really need to review our understanding of the economics of that time and place where Jesus lived. Remember, this was a time of Roman oppression. The Romans were in the south, and the farmers, the Galileans, they were in the north. And the farmers and those who worked hard on the land, they provided the wheat and the oil and the wine that was needed by the Romans in the south. Now, you'd think that that would be a great boon to those farmers and they could become wealthy. But they were subjected to huge and unfair taxes. Now, defraud is not the word that's used in this parable, but everyone at that time would have understood that there were hidden profits for the wealthy land owners that they extracted from the poorest of the poor. Now, New Testament professor Barbara Rossing describes it like this. Rich landlords and rulers were loan sharks using exorbitant interest rates to amass more land and to disinherit peasants of their family land in direct violation of biblical covenantal law. The rich man or the lord, along with his steward or debt collector, were both exploiting desperate peasants. You see, the manager in this parable, he was accused of not squeezing enough profits out of the farmers. And, the way this worked, they would have to pay these taxes and would not be able to do so. And so they would be forced to sell to those wealthy men down south who would then continue to charge them exorbitant rates of taxes. Now, the manager, realizing when he's called by his owner, by the boss, that he is very little value to him, he decides to do something kind of radical. He decides to switch sides. He decides to ingratiate himself with the farmers who, after all is said and done, they might be able to help him later on. He decides to use this system to help the poor and to build, relationships, instead of using the system to build his own wealth. He may have taken out his cut of the profits to do this. Now, the Pharisees, Jesus tells us, loved money a little too much. If you can imagine, the whole economy, including the faith community, was tainted with this system. The rich people of this time got by with paying very little in the system of taxation. Can you imagine? The poor bore the brunt of the tax burden. The Romans taxed the small farmers, and like I said, they couldn't pay that, and they ended up having to sell. And then they still couldn't pay these jacked up taxes. The managers were the middlemen who went up north to collect these rents for the wealthy landowners. So there was a rich man, and he heard that his manager was not optimizing his investment, and he called him on it. He may have even blamed the farmers. What are they? Are they just lazy? Can't they pay what they owe? Now, I know that some of you have some experience with farming, or at least gardening, and I know all of you are familiar with hard work. I have never met a lazy farmer, not one that stays in business for long. It's hard work, isn't it? But the landowner was pretty removed from that harsh reality. And that manager, the middle-class guy, he was just trying to get by, even though he had been feeding into this dishonest system. But then he finds himself facing an uncertain future. He says, I am not strong enough to dig, and I'm too embarrassed to beg. And that's when he decides to align himself with the poor people that he has been helping to defraud. Now, he will still get some return on the investment for the landowner, but it'll be just a little bit fairer. He maybe finally saw through this system of injustice, this economic system that benefited only the wealthy and not the poor. Well, in case those hearing Jesus don't get it, he spells it out. It is better to use money in service of relationships rather than using relationships in service of money. That term describing the manager as a shrewd man, well, it means that he wised up and found a way to change, at least a little bit, to work to change this unjust system where the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. And if they and we still don't get it, there is that last bit. You cannot serve God and wealth. Well, the reality of that time and of ours is that we do have to use money in our day-to-day lives. But we don't have to have an unhealthy relationship with money. What Jesus tells them then is to use money, but value people. Use money, but value people. Perhaps that loan officer that I used to know had the right idea after all. You know, that bank did not go under. And the community saw him as a kind and compassionate person. So my question for me today, for you today, my question is, church, is our money serving God, or are we serving our money?